In Cleveland, Ohio, a strange outbreak that strikes infants. It is a mother's worst fear. Newborns pour into a pediatric intensive care unit, their lungs damaged and bleeding. Doctors search desperately for the cause as the babies begin to die. The quest to save young lives becomes a race to find a killer. Some of the names in this program have been changed. Cleveland, Ohio, November 1994. It started with a call to the paramedics. A father dialed 911 when his newborn baby was spitting up blood.
Let's try to bring this heart rate down some. Our pulse ox is starting to drift down.
In the ambulance, the paramedics found that 3-month-old Derek Roberts' lungs were bleeding so heavily, he was having difficulty breathing. They worked hard to keep his airways clear. As they rushed to the hospital, they put him on IV fluids to combat his extensive blood loss. They did everything they could for him. But when Derek arrived at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, he was barely alive. Dr. Dor Dearborn was the respiratory specialist called in to consult on the case. When he heard about the infant's severe condition, he feared the worst.
When a child comes in, usually to the emergency room with bleeding coming out of the nose and or mouth, coughing blood, this is a very frightening process because we know that this can be life-threatening.
The baby's lungs were still filling with blood. His father, Alvin Roberts, was devastated. He had no idea how his newborn son had become so desperately ill.
Yeah, so you were home when this happened?
Yes, I was.
Has he been sick at all?
No, sir, not at all.
So tell me what happened this morning.
When my wife was feeding him a bottle, and all of a sudden he just started coughing up blood.
Had he ever coughed blood before?
No, he has not.
This is really quite serious. Come over here and let me show you this.
Young Derek had lost a lot of blood.
This is his heart, and this is his lungs. And see how
A look at Derek's x-rays confirmed to Dr. Dearborn that he had a potentially deadly condition.
and see how cloudy his lungs look? That's because there's probably blood in there. And we're going to give him a blood transfusion.
The doctor
Make up the
ordered
blood
transfusions to keep the infant from growing any weaker. Derek was still struggling to breathe.
Infants being in such severe respiratory status cannot breathe adequately for themselves. They're in a state of what we call respiratory failure, and we have to breathe for them.
Little Derek was put on a ventilator to help him breathe and sent to the pediatric intensive care unit.
Here.
Dr. Dearborn looked to the lab results to find the source of the dangerous symptoms.
There are a number of things that can cause bleeding in the lungs, such as trauma, such as a very severe infection. One has to sort out that the bleeding is actually coming from the lungs.
Dearborn and his colleague, pediatrician Paul Smith, were mystified. Derek had no previous history of respiratory disorders like bronchitis or allergies. There was no family history of lung disease. Test results showed that the baby's lungs had been bleeding for several days, but they had no idea why.
In the process of trying to sort out what was going on with him. We put him through all the testing we could imagine that might come up with other causes for what was going on with this infant. And we found no other causes.
While Dearborn was searching for some clue to Derek's condition, another worried parent was bringing her child to the emergency room with symptoms just as dangerous. Like little Derek, young Robert was brought to the ER when his mother found he was spitting up blood.
The danger that we need to assess quickly is to how severe it is. The more severe cases, if they don't make it to our emergency room quickly, they can die.
Dearborn requested chest x-rays along with blood and urine samples. Doctors told Robert's mother his prognosis wasn't good.
I was very scared. I was praying for him. I was crying, upset, just pacing, walking back and forth, wondering what's wrong with my son. Is he gonna be okay?
The paramedics' quick work had helped stabilize the boy's heartbeat. But the bleeding in his lungs continued. Doctors administered steroids to reduce the inflammation and swelling in his lungs, and continued suctioning blood to keep his airways open. Robert was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit and placed on a ventilator.
It was 3 to 5 days that they required the mechanical ventilation. And then once they were stabilized off of the ventilator for a day or so in the intensive care unit, they would be transferred up to the regular floor.
The infants eventually got better and were sent home. But later that month, at an outpatient clinic associated with the Children's Hospital, Dr. Dearborn learned of 3 more cases in a single day. All were infants that had been rushed to the hospital over the preceding months with similar conditions. Now improved, they were coming back for routine checkups. But no one had put the cases together. Typically, doctors at the hospital saw at most 1 case like this a year.
It was frightening because it meant that we were having a major problem, of a life-threatening problem with infants. And somehow we had to start thinking about how we were going to get ahead of this.
The Cleveland Hospital treats tens of thousands of children every year. With over 100 pediatric specialists, Dr. Dearborn wondered if more doctors could be seeing the same condition without realizing the extent of the problem. He scoured hospital records until he found 2 more babies that had come in with blood in their lungs. One case confirmed his worst fears. 6 months earlier, a baby boy had been rushed to the hospital with severe pulmonary bleeding.
One of the infants was bleeding so heavily on the ventilator that he, in essence, drowned in his own blood.
Doctors were unable to find the cause of the bleeding. Dearborn had no idea what was triggering these illnesses, but he knew he had to find out quickly before more babies died.
So how long?
Dearborn requested samples from all the children with similar symptoms. In the lab, technicians analyzed the infant's lung tissue. In all 6 cases, testing indicated the infants had suffered pulmonary hemorrhaging. Something had caused blood vessels in the baby's lungs to rupture. Dearborn discussed the findings with pediatric intensive care specialist Dr. Paul Smith. Smith speculated that the babies had come in contact with airborne toxins of some kind.
In the literature, frequently there are children that are described that are exposed to pesticides, carpet cleaner, other things in the environment such as smoke, inhaled poisons.
Dearborn reviewed the infant's charts once again, looking for clues. Some common link that all the children shared.
I started to look at the addresses where these infants are coming from, translated their addresses into census tracts, and then plotted those census tracts as to where they live.
The census maps held one startling piece of evidence. All of the babies lived in the same extended area. Inner city neighborhoods within 6 miles of the hospital.
My first thought was, well, is there something in the local environment? Are we dealing with a love canal situation? Are we dealing with an environmental contamination?
Dr. Dearborn needed help. He contacted the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Environmental epidemiologist Dr. Ruth Etzel arrived in Cleveland later that day.
I'm a medical detective. CDC calls on me when there's an epidemic of a disease that they can't understand and that they'd like to try to get to the bottom of. My job is to go out and try to solve the mystery.
Etzel and a team of health officials interviewed the children's parents.
And I do believe that we can help.
They were looking for anything the families had in common. Soon, they had several clues. All of the babies lived with cigarette smokers. All were fed formula. And all lived in houses recently damaged by water. But none of these factors could explain such a severe condition.
Since we did not know what we were dealing with, other than it seemed to be in the home, we put together a very wide net. We put together anything we could think of that these infants might be exposed to in the home, from the water to how the formula was made up, to the medications that might be in the home, and things like this.
Investigators met to pore over the information, hoping to uncover some key clue that would point them to the source of the illness. But the problem continued. As they searched, more and more children were falling ill. Carol Jameson was getting ready for work one December morning when her infant son Andrew began spitting up blood. She rushed him to nearby Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. As the ER staff hustled Andrew into the exam room, Carol frantically explained his condition. On the surface, Andrew didn't seem too ill. The ER doctor checked his airway for any obstructions. It appeared to be clear. He ordered a battery of tests, including chest x-rays, to see if the problem was in the infant's lungs, and paged Dr. Dearborn.
I'm just going to ask that you wear the apron. This is the shield, baby.
The doctor was very concerned that he might be facing yet another child with life-threatening bleeding in the lungs.
So you're effectively ventilating out there? Yes. Let me just take a look.
The baby was no longer spitting up blood, but that didn't necessarily mean the bleeding had stopped.
Okay, go ahead.
Doctor, here's the x-ray.
Okay, thanks. Oh boy, yeah. We've got the right upper lobe sucked in.
Andrew's x-rays showed his lungs were inflamed. He was now the 10th confirmed case of this rare and deadly disorder.
Ma'am, besides the bleeding, he's having trouble breathing.
His breathing soon became more labored.
It's going to last longer than just...
Doctors pumped oxygen into Andrew's lungs, but his condition was quickly deteriorating. Dr. Dearborn explained to the baby's mother, Carol, what they were going to do to help Andrew breathe.
We're going to have to put a breathing tube down into his trachea. We're going to do that initially here, and then we're going to move him up to the intensive care unit where we can watch him more carefully and for a longer period of time.
Little Andrew was clinging to life, but it was only the mechanical ventilator that was keeping him alive. 1 month after the outbreak began, health officials had no idea what was causing the infants in Cleveland to become so desperately ill. For now, all they could do was hope Andrew's tiny body could fight off this sudden and mysterious illness. Something terrible was causing a life-threatening illness in the children living in Cleveland. A series of healthy infants from area inner-city neighborhoods had all developed bleeding lungs. One child did not survive. 2 others were still in critical condition, and more were falling ill each day. Cleveland pediatricians joined forces with state and local health officials and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. To find out why, they launched a case control study to compare healthy infants and sick infants from the same neighborhoods. The list of possibilities was extensive, but the results were not. They needed more information. Investigators were dispatched to the homes of the babies who had suffered from the bleeding lungs. They found that the infants' neighborhoods were in an older section of Cleveland, with some houses in poor condition. Investigators checked their homes for hazardous cleaners, paints, pesticides, anything that might have triggered the illness. They used alcohol wipes to gather residue from areas where pesticides are usually applied. They focused their efforts on the babies' rooms. Because infants' lungs are still developing, they are fragile and more sensitive. Investigators thought they might be inhaling something that wouldn't normally affect adults. They used a tiny high-tech vacuum to collect dust particles that might have caused the babies to have an allergic reaction. The particles were tested for common allergens caused by pets, insects, or dust. In all, they tested the homes for over a dozen different types of chemicals and allergens. Every patient from the neighborhood who came into the hospital with respiratory problems was examined for bleeding lungs or any other similar symptoms.
We were having multiple cases like this in our inner city community. That was very frightening because we didn't know how deep the iceberg was. Were we just seeing the top of it? Were we just seeing the few cases that were severe? And were there other cases out there that were much more subtle, that if they got ill in some certain way or had some sort of other trigger that pushed them over the edge, they would suddenly bleed and die?
Dearborn hoped that the tests on the pesticide and dust samples from the homes would give them a lead. But they did not. In fact, so far the intensive investigation had turned up nothing.
When the test results came in, we saw that they were not high enough nor prevalent enough in the case homes to be a meaningful explanation.
Dr. Ruth Etzel of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had been trying to find some kind of lead. Then a clue turned up from a most unlikely source. After talking with a colleague, Etzel learned that certain animals had suffered a similar condition as the infants when ingesting a mold called Stachybotrys.
I realized that if animals bleed from the gastrointestinal tract when they eat moldy grain, why couldn't infants bleed from the lungs when they breathe into the spores of a mold called Stachybotrys?
It seemed like a long shot. Most molds are harmless microscopic organisms found almost everywhere, indoors and out. Stachybotrys is a toxic mold, often found in homes that have suffered water damage. It appears as a dark olive gray slimy mass with either a smooth or rigid surface. When investigators remembered that all the sick children had lived in homes with recent water damage, their long shot became a working hypothesis. They decided to test the children's homes for Stachybotrys spores.
We went back to the original families and asked them if we could come to their home to measure molds in the air and on the surfaces.
They did a visual inspection of the babies' rooms looking for mold. None was found. Next, they went to the basements, the most common location for mold. Any moist environment is a perfect breeding ground for mold. Many building materials provide nutrients for mold to grow, including paper products, ceiling tiles, and wood. The investigators did find several patches of a slimy green-black mold. They wondered if it could be Stachybotrys. Although they hadn't seen any mold in the babies' bedrooms, public health officials also decided to collect air samples, looking for airborne spores. They set up special pumps containing filter cassettes to trap the particles. Investigators were on a promising track, but it would take time for the labs to run the tests. Time to see if the infants had in fact encountered the Stachybotrys mold. And as the clock ticked, more sick babies were pouring in to Cleveland's hospitals. A dozen infants in Cleveland had contracted a strange illness that caused their lungs to bleed. Now, the CDC was on the case, with local, state, and federal health officials to find the cause before more babies died. They thought the outbreak might be linked to a mold called Stachybotrys. Officials had rushed samples from the infants' homes to the lab for testing. Scientists incubated the spores in a moist, humid environment, ideal growing conditions for mold. In a few days, the mold grew. Scientists examined the first samples carefully for clues.
There were several things that were remarkable about the laboratory findings. First, we found that the homes of all the babies with lung bleeding had far more varieties of mold growing than did the homes of the babies without lung bleeding.
More significantly, Stachybotrys was found in the homes of the babies with bleeding lungs. If Stachybotrys seemed like a likely suspect, one characteristic puzzled scientists. This mold is normally slimy and moist and not airborne. They wondered if the babies could have inhaled it and how. Determined to get to the root of this outbreak, investigators in Cleveland went back to the houses of the sick children, hoping to find answers. In the basements, they discovered several patches of mold that appeared to be a dried form of Stachybotrys. Investigators believed the spores were being drawn in by basement furnaces and pulled through the ductwork into every room of the house. The theory made even more sense when something startling happened. Half the infants cured at the hospital came back, bleeding again after returning home. When Alvin Roberts brought his son Derek back to the hospital, physicians discovered that Derek had a twin sister named Diana. Although the infants shared the same environment, Diana hadn't suffered from the same symptoms. But Dearborn worried that while Diana appeared healthy, her life might in fact be in danger. He asked to examine her. Using a bronchoscope, the doctor looked into the baby girl's airways. They appeared to be functioning normally. He inserted a tube to look for any signs of blood. Diana's lungs had been bleeding, probably for some time, though not as severely as her brother's.
It was fortunate that we've detected her low-grade bleeding problem so we could protect her from having more severe bleeding, where she could have been coughing blood and really having a major life-threatening situation.
If even a seemingly healthy girl could have been affected, the condition might be much more widespread than anyone had guessed. Dr. Dearborn had the coroner examine infant death certificates dating back 3 years, focusing on children whose cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome. Scientists re-examined lung tissue from over 100 deceased children and found that 6 had bleeding lungs, which may have led to their deaths. All 6 came from the same neighborhoods as the more recent cases.
This meant to us that there had been cases that we had missed, as had been our fear, and that we were dealing predominantly with a geographic location.
Andrew Jameson slowly began to recover from his life-threatening illness. When his mother Carol brought him in for his checkups, Dr. Dearborn had good news and bad news. Little Andrew would eventually make a full recovery. But as a precaution, she needed to move out of their mold-infested home.
Most of the families had been through a very frightening process. They had almost lost their infant, and they weren't going to take any risks. And so they all very readily found a new home environment with relatives to start out with, and then most of them were in rental situations, and they moved to new rental homes that we inspected and made sure were clean before they moved into them.
The evidence all seemed to point toward mold as the most probable cause. Health officials launched a public information campaign about the potential dangers associated with Stachybotrys.
A rare fungus found around standing water and paper or wood was found in the homes of sick babies. If you have any standing water in your home, such as you might find under your kitchen sink around leaky drain pipes, you're advised to clean it up.
The culprit would become known as toxic mold. And the campaign would have a profound effect on the community. Especially as the cases began to spread. Letitia McCarrick was driving to the store when she realized her son Brian had a bloody nose. Then his crying turned into a choked gurgle. Frightened, Letitia knew her little boy needed immediate medical care. She pulled off to a local business for help. Nearly 2 years after the first case appeared, a whole new group of infants in Cleveland, Ohio, were about to experience sudden and dangerous bleeding, fighting for their lives. In 1996, doctors in Ohio were battling a deadly condition that had stricken more than a dozen infants. The baby's lungs were bleeding, an extremely rare disorder in young children. Investigators believed the condition was caused by a toxic mold that was growing in the patient's homes. Letitia McCarrick's infant son, Brian, had begun bleeding from his nose. Now he was having difficulty breathing. The worried mother gave paramedics Brian's medical history. She had no idea what could have caused this. An ambulance rushed him to the children's hospital. Paramedics worked quickly to suction blood from his lungs, but Brian barely responded. They rushed the baby into the emergency room, where a doctor examined him. Brian's condition was so critical, he was immediately transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit. In the middle of her panic, Letitia suddenly remembered a news story about Stachybotrys. She told the ER doctor she feared the mold might be the cause.
When I arrived at Rainbow, I was still persistent on explaining that I had seen something about this on television and that there had to be somebody at this hospital that knew what I was talking about. And they explained that Dr. Dearborn was on his way down to the emergency room. He had already heard that there was a baby coming in.
Once Brian was stabilized, Dr. Dearborn performed a bronchoscopy. The procedure confirmed Brian's lungs were full of blood. Dearborn believed he could be dealing with another case of Stachybotrys exposure.
Dr. Dearborn came in and met with my husband and I and discussed the different things that were going on with Brian's immune system, with what could be in our home.
Health inspectors were dispatched to the McCarrick's home. If confirmed, this would be one of the few cases outside of inner-city Cleveland, a sign that the toxic mold was more widespread than investigators had thought. Health officials began their search in the basement. They found traces of mold, but they weren't sure it was the kind they were looking for. They gathered samples to find out. The results were surprising.
The original health inspection at our home came back negative surface samples, negative air samples.
Dr. Dearborn wondered if the infant had been exposed somewhere else.
My husband was bound and determined that there had to be a problem in the house. That was the only place that my son had really been, besides my parents' house.
David McCarrick refused to give up. His instincts told him to conduct his own inspection, scouring every inch of the house.
So my husband was more persistent and ended up going into a crawl space in our basement where I had some things in storage. Started going through books and boxes and finding this mold.
The McCarricks were right. The family had the mold removed, and after nearly a week in the hospital, Brian's condition improved. The family was ready to return home, but they would have to wait.
After we were released from the hospital, my children and I had to go and stay with my in-laws for, I would say, somewhere around a month while my husband worked on our house, our basement, and our heating system and our cold air returns.
In the months that followed, public health officials gradually brought the epidemic under control in Cleveland.
We started a prevention program where we would follow up the newborns going home to the geographic cluster area, and the city housing and county housing and health departments would provide an inspection of the homes to see whether there was water damage, whether there was mold. And where we found significant water damage and mold, we did what we could to remove the infants from that environment until it was taken care of.
Investigators published the results of their study in hopes of alerting other health officials to their findings.
We wanted to find out whether this was unique to Cleveland or whether or not it was occurring elsewhere.
The answer that came back was alarming. Their cases were indeed just the tip of the iceberg. As 1998 was dawning, more cases of pulmonary hemorrhaging in infants were turning up all over the country. Doctors wondered if Stachybotrys could be affecting older children. They soon found out. Over 800 miles away from Cleveland, Dr. Jay Portnoy, an allergist at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was treating toddler Brian Chubb for a severe asthma problem. Despite medication, Brian's asthma persisted. The doctor tested Brian, but he showed no reaction to molds, dust, or any other allergens. A full physical exam revealed that Brian was an otherwise healthy toddler.
When I first saw Brian, he had a history of asthma. He had a lot of respiratory problems, a lot of wheezing and coughing and difficulty breathing, and he was needing to be on a lot of medication in order to control those symptoms.
Brian's mother and father, Lori and Stephen Chubb, heard about children having respiratory problems because of Stachybotrys mold. But Brian was older than the cases reported in Cleveland. Still, Brian's parents wondered if there might be a connection between mold and their child's asthma. They were concerned, and Brian was suffering.
You hear the wheezing clear down into his lungs, and getting up in the morning and eating breakfast, he would have I almost called it a smoker's cough, a very dry, hacking cough in the morning at the breakfast table almost every morning. And it's just sad to listen to a very tiny child that is almost having trouble, struggling to just take a breath.
Dr. Portnoy requested Brian's family have an environmental assessment done of their home. Industrial hygienist Susan Flappin was brought in to inspect the boy's home. First, she tested the air in the basement. And right away, the findings were clear.
And we found that there was Stachybotrys in the air in the basement, and that the mold counts were high in the basement.
Brian's father, Stephen Chubb, was amazed at the quantity of the mold spores.
When they started telling us that normal household has 3,000 to 4,000 particles of mold, and we were testing in our basement at 12,000 particles, it definitely drew our attention.
The mold was growing out of control. But for Susan Flappin and health officials nationwide, the most alarming thing was that it was beginning to happen all across the country. An outbreak of bleeding lungs threatened the lives of infants in Cleveland. Now, a Kansas City doctor suspected Stachybotrys mold was affecting the health of children there as well. When industrial hygienist Susan Flappin was called into one sick boy's home, she got high readings for airborne mold, but she couldn't locate the source.
A lot of times there is hidden mold, and so it can be, you may see just a small patch of mold on the outside of the wall, but when you get into it, it could be a very large patch, or it could be hidden underneath the carpet or in the ventilation system or any number of places. So this was something that we needed to investigate further.
An examiner took apart the wall where Susan believed the mold might be hiding.
The mold and the water was behind the wall of a finished part of the basement that you could not see.
Lurking behind the finished walls of the Chubb's basement was the toxic mold Stachybotrys.
What you really need to do in those circumstances is try to physically remove the mold by cutting out the sheetrock, or if you can remove the wood, you need to remove it and replace it. That's really the only solution. If you can't physically remove it, the best you can do is just to scrub it off as best as you can and seal it up.
An environmental technician went to work removing it from the walls with a non-toxic cleaning agent and disinfecting the entire area. Once the cleanup was complete, Susan returned to test the air in the house for Stachybotrys mold particles.
The counts actually had gone from the 12,000 level to about 100, and so it had dramatically dropped.
6 months after the house was cleared of mold, the child's asthma symptoms also disappeared.
And it convinced me that there probably was an association between the exposure that he had in his home to the mold and the symptoms he was experiencing.
On the other side of town, the mold was hitting even harder. For the first time, an entire family was experiencing chronic health problems. 12-year-old Amy McGuire struggled with recurring stomach pain and high fevers. Doctors could not find the cause of her illness. For months, her mother Julie was alarmed.
When everybody was so sick, especially Amy, I was very concerned and I was extremely frustrated because all I would hear from the doctors is, well, it's some kind of virus. It's some kind of virus. We don't know what it is.
For the McGuire family, a television news segment on Stachybotrys mold offered a possible clue to their chronic illness.
The light bulb went on in my head and I really had a gut feeling that we were now dealing with mold. Definitely.
While watching the program, they were called that a handyman remodeling the family's basement had removed an old shower and exposed a large section of wall covered with a slimy black mold. The handyman had developed respiratory problems almost immediately, and soon after, the family did too. Julie contacted the allergist interviewed in the news clip and set up an appointment.
I told her the story about our shower being remodeled, that there had been mold behind it, that 2 members of the family at least had been sick numerous times over just the past few months, and she became very, very interested in our story.
Because of her experience, Susan Flappin was called in to inspect the McGuire's basement. Although the family had cleaned the mold exposed by the shower, Sue suspected that there were traces left. She took samples for testing.
We discovered that they also had some mold, and because it was so close to the furnace, that mold could be distributed to other parts of the house.
Susan also brought a nurse to take blood samples from the entire family. She wanted to see if their blood contained traces of the Stachybotrys toxins. Lab analysis of the basement samples showed that Stachybotrys was in the McGuire's house. To avoid further exposure, the McGuires had their home professionally cleaned with bleach and special filters to clean the air. Within weeks, they began to recover. Analyzing the McGuire's blood samples, Susan also found an interesting result.
She told us that every one of us had the antibodies in our blood. Our daughter Amy had the highest reading, and then Steve had the second highest, and then me, and then our son Sean. And it really made a lot of sense because Amy was the sickest.
While toxic mold has always been around, it is only recently that the full effects of mold are beginning to be understood. From Texas to California to Florida, there have been thousands of reported cases. Some reports say that up to 30% of U.S. homes have a mold problem, affecting as many as 26 million Americans. And yet, because the science of this mold is just in its infancy, no one knows for sure exactly how many respiratory diseases can be directly linked to Stachybotrys.
While our focus in Cleveland has predominantly been on the connection with young infants and their apparent vulnerability, there has been a beginning recognition that mold, particularly toxic molds, can be of health problems to older children and adults. And here there's a fair amount of controversy because we really don't know exactly what the health effects are.
In light of growing concern over mold, the CDC is currently working on a more complete study to further explore the connection between Stachybotrys and a wide range of respiratory illnesses, including asthma, allergies, and lung infections. Other research is underway to determine what levels of exposure to mold can be harmful. Dr. Dor Dearborn believes that for now, the best cure against any potentially toxic mold exposure is prevention.
It only makes sense that we take a prudent approach and don't live in moldy environments. And the way we do that is when we have a water problem, a plumbing leak, a roof leak, we clean it up within a day or two so that we don't get mold growth.
Infants in Cleveland who recovered from the possible effects of toxic mold have grown up and are now breathing easier.
This entire experience changed everything on how I look at life. And now I try and take the time to sit back and enjoy life and not always be in a hurry and not always take everything for granted. Quickly, things that are very, very important to you can be taken away from you, in particular, people that you love.
Natasha Carter is thankful for Dr. Dearborn's help and her son Robert's recovery.
You've been doing good, but every time I move now, I have to get my house checked to make sure that it's safe for my son.
For those public health officials who continue to study mold, identifying Stachybotrys as a possible threat is only the beginning.
The success of any individual scientific discovery is whether or not we've learned something about health that is going to benefit the people. And in fact, here, I believe we've learned something that's benefited hundreds of young infants throughout the country.
Today, across America, doctors and patients alike are now alerted to the potentially deadly symptoms of Stachybotrys mold. While mold has always been in people's homes, even the Stachybotrys mold, no one can say how widespread this problem could be. And until scientists know more, the battle against toxic mold will continue, one home at a time. It strikes with terrifying speed, a bacterial disease that can kill within hours. And the victims are all children and teenagers. In Alberta, Canada, scientists must try to identify the infection and find the cause of the outbreak before it can turn into an epidemic. With more and more lives on the line, they'll have to take drastic measures before it's too late. Christmas 1999 passed quietly for most residents in Edmonton, Canada. But for one family, the holiday season was about to become a nightmare. The day after Christmas, 18-year-old Matthew Boulding woke up with a stiff neck and a fever. His mother knew her son had been working hard in his first semester at college. She assumed he had the flu until she saw his arms. They were covered with strange splotches, like dark purple bruises. Carol Boulding had no idea what she was looking at. But she knew there was something terribly wrong with her son. As Matthew was rushed to the hospital, paramedics worked to stabilize him.
I was very, very scared that we were losing Matthew. It was really a very scary time.
At the University of Alberta Hospital, Matthew was hurried into the emergency room. By the time they reached the ER, his mother was becoming more and more worried. She headed straight for the admitting nurse. She felt there was no time to waste.
I was going over to her and saying, every second counts, every minute counts, and we really, you've got to do something.
Dr. Michael Bullard responded quickly. As he examined the dazed teenager, Dr. Bullard knew that Matthew's body aches and stiff neck could be symptomatic of dozens of different illnesses.
As an emergency physician, our training is such that we're taught to think of the most dangerous and most lethal diagnosis that could present in this manner first.
So this is quite a purplish rash. When did it start? Did you see it just this morning?
Just this morning.
Oddest and most troubling, the purple splotches on Matthew's hands.
And so it's been...
And now the mysterious rash was spreading to his legs and feet. Known as petechiae, they are caused by broken blood vessels under the skin.
We need to get some blood tests done.
Dr. Bullard couldn't be sure, but he had a suspicion what these spots might mean.
Wait here. I'm just going to get the nurse.
The boy had a dangerous form of bacterial meningitis.
The usual initial symptoms are just sore throat, headache, muscle aches, and low-grade fevers, and sometimes a little bit of diarrhea. But this can either quickly or gradually progress into a much more serious form of infection.
Meningitis is a condition that inflames the lining of the spine and the brain.
And have you had a cough at all?
But in its most severe form, called meningococcemia, something worse happens.
Can you just open your mouth for me?
It triggers a so-called inflammatory cascade, a runaway reaction of the immune system and widespread organ failure. Left untreated, it is one of the few diseases that can kill within hours.
When we see anybody with a dangerous infection that we think is bacterial, the current standard of care is to start antibiotics as soon as things like blood cultures and urine cultures are drawn.
Just wait here for a second. Denise, sorry, can you help in here? I think he's got meningococcus. You'll need to...
Dr. Bullard ordered intravenous antibiotics.
We need to start an IV.
If Matthew was suffering from meningitis, he couldn't wait 24 hours for test results. In 24 hours, it could be too late. Meningitis can be highly contagious. Passed by a cough or a sneeze, or any contact with droplets from the nose and throat of an infected person. Until the diagnosis was certain, Matthew needed to be kept away from other patients. Even those treating him needed to wear protective clothing. Drawing blood and spinal fluid samples, the nurse sent the specimens to the laboratory. At the University of Alberta's state-of-the-art hospital lab, Dr. Greg Turrell, a clinical microbiologist, received samples of Matthew's blood for testing.
When the blood culture arrives in the laboratory, it still has to be incubated to allow the organism to grow. And this may take anywhere from 18 to 20 hours.
Once the blood is incubated, scientists can determine if the specimens contain any foreign organisms. What they're looking for is carbon dioxide, a byproduct of growing bacteria.
Blood is loaded into a blood culture vial and it's loaded onto a machine. The vials themselves have detectors loaded on the bottom of the bottle. And as the bacteria grow in this very nutritious environment, they release CO2.
In Matthew's case, there was no doubt. Sensors indicated an increased level of carbon dioxide. Matthew's blood was testing positive for bacteria. The only question was exactly what type. Bacteria have distinct cell shapes. Even after the cells are dead and no longer infectious, microbiologists can determine the cell shape and identify the bacteria. When the sample is mixed with a colored solution, the shape of the cell emerges. A kind of fingerprint, revealing the precise type of bacteria. The verdict from the lab was swift and shocking. Matthew had been infected by a particularly virulent and deadly form of bacterial meningitis. It triggers an infection that can cause blood clots in the arms, legs, and brain, leading to coma and shock. Without blood, tissue in the arms and legs dies. Doctors can be forced to amputate. And in 10 to 15% of the cases, it results in death. For Dr. Bullard, it was difficult to give Matthew's parents and sister such a grim diagnosis.
Matthew has an infection that we think is caused by a bacteria called meningococcemia. And
their son had been perfectly healthy just days before. Now, he was fighting for his life. A stunned Carol Boulding coped the only way she knew how. She began to educate herself on Matthew's condition.
I would ask, what are his blood platelets at, and what's the average, what's low, what's normal. And I felt like I knew a little bit more, because it's that not knowing that is frightening when you're in hospital. So I felt a little bit more in control that way.
So we have to watch that closely.
Carol soon learned that Matthew was being given massive amounts of antibiotics, but there was no guarantee they would work.
We wouldn't expect to see much in the way of improvement for at least 24 to 48 hours, because usually it takes some time for the antibiotic to first get into the system and to reach a therapeutic dose range, and then to actually allow the body to start to recover.
All Matthew's doctors and family could do was watch his condition and wait.
When your child is ill, you have to deal with whatever you have to deal with. But I don't think you really breathe again until they tell you can.
Matthew's doctors contacted Dr. Jerry Preddy of the Capitol Health Authority. Meningitis is infectious and can quickly spread out of control in a community. Health officials track every case. Matthew's was actually the second instance of meningitis reported in Edmonton that December.
While it was of some concern to have 2 cases in a week, it was nothing that we thought was particularly out of the ordinary.
As a precaution, Dr. Preddy asked his staff to issue a warning to area hospitals and clinics. Every doctor in the area needed to be on the lookout for cases of meningitis. The disease is most prevalent in the winter. The cold, dry weather makes people more susceptible, especially children and teenagers.
When your mucous membranes, the linings of your nose and throat get dry, they do tend to be, it tends to be easier for various germs, including this one, to get into the lining and then cause infections.
The doctors were closely tracking Matthew's progress. Within 2 days, the antibiotics had started to kick in. Slowly but steadily, Matthew was starting to recover. But the doctors couldn't figure out where this virulent meningitis had come from. They needed a list of everyone, family and friends, he had come in contact with before he began showing symptoms.
It is transmitted through people who cough or sneeze. Little droplets form, and it can be transmitted to someone else that way, or through saliva. If people, for example, share a cigarette or share a drink, then they can get it that way.
Doctors examined Matthew's family and his girlfriend. No one showed signs of the disease. Health officials were baffled how Matthew contracted the disease and if anyone else was infected. They could only hope they had seen the last meningitis case of the season. But in a city near Edmonton, another teenager had started to feel ill. 17-year-old Ryan Zelke was a popular high school senior. He played lead guitar in a garage band. On January 7th, a week after Matthew Bolding became sick, Ryan experienced a severe asthma attack. He had had asthma problems for most of his life. When Ryan's mother took him to the doctor, he was diagnosed with the flu. His parents kept a close watch on his condition. But he became weaker, developing severe aches and pains.
I have to go to the bathroom.
He was too weak to walk to the bathroom on his own. Then Michelle Zelke saw the splotches on her son's chest. She didn't know what caused them, but this much was certain. Her son was in trouble. They had to get Ryan to the hospital. There was no time to wait for an ambulance. The car would be faster. On the way, Ryan told his mother that his chest was starting to tighten. He was having difficulty breathing. Michelle could feel his heartbeat weakening as she tried to find a pulse. In the ER, the doctors were alarmed. Ryan's pulse was erratic. His blood pressure was plummeting. He had fallen unconscious. And then he started to flatline. Ryan was crashing. The ER staff worked frantically to revive him.
Okay, clear. Michelle
Zelke went to be with her husband. Their son was in trouble, and there was nothing they could do. For over an hour, the medical team tried to resuscitate the boy. But in the end, he couldn't be saved. On January 10th, 17-year-old Ryan Zelke was pronounced dead. And he would not be the last victim of meningitis in Edmonton that winter. The outbreak was just beginning. In January of 2000, a 17-year-old boy came down with flu symptoms. 48 hours later, he was dead. Doctors suspected his death was caused by a dangerous strain of bacteria. Medical examiners performed an autopsy, looking for clues to confirm the diagnosis. Because the bacteria in his blood was still infectious, they wore protective clothing. They had to figure out exactly what had happened to the young man, why the disease had hit him so hard, so rapidly. The bacterial infection had damaged his blood vessels, leading to shock and complete organ failure. At the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton, technicians examined Ryan's blood and tissue samples, looking for clues. Initial tests confirmed that he had bacterial meningitis. Doctors forwarded the lab and autopsy results to the health authority. Officials feared this might be the start of an outbreak. Ryan was the third case in less than a month.
One more, and that is in this area of the city.
Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Jerry Preddy, feared the worst.
In this case, even when our number of cases was not anywhere near what people would consider an outbreak situation, it was our gut feeling that there was something unusual happening.
Following Ryan's tragic death, the Edmonton news media got a warning out to the public. The group most at risk? Teenagers.
There are probably a number of reasons why teenagers and young adults are more at risk, but it's the behavior issues, the behavioral types of behaviors that they engage in that put them at risk.
More than any other age group, teenagers tend to gather in large numbers. Day or night, in classrooms or parties, they are jammed together, sharing sodas, cigarettes, or affection. In each of these exchanges, the bacteria can spread from one person to another. But the puzzle for investigators was that none of the meningitis patients had attended the same school. They still didn't know where the outbreak originated. On the hunt for clues, investigators questioned Ryan Zelke's parents.
Thanks for seeing us.
There was one starting point. All three victims lived within the Edmonton area.
He's gone to, what was the last?
Investigators wondered if the victims knew one another or had attended the same party, or come in contact at any type of gathering. But Ryan's parents weren't certain of any specific social events their son had recently been to. Looking for links, investigators also questioned Matthew Boulding, hoping to find out where and when he might have encountered the other two victims. But there were no easy answers. All three patients had never met. The trail would be even harder to find.
The issue in tracking the source of infection is that most people who have the organism don't have any symptoms. So most of the people who acquire the illness likely acquire it from an asymptomatic individual.
All over Edmonton, public health nurses tried to get the word out. warning teenagers to go to a doctor immediately if they experienced flu-like symptoms followed by a telltale purple rash. But the lethal bacterium was on the move, and it couldn't be stopped. The outbreak was now entering a more dangerous, more baffling phase, targeting even younger victims. Days after Michelle Zelke lost her son to meningitis, another worried mother sat in the emergency room at the University of Alberta Hospital. 4-year-old Alex Hansen seemed to have a bad case of the flu.
My husband had the flu the week before, so I just assumed that he had caught the flu from my husband because he had, the same symptoms, not wanting to eat, a little bit tired.
But as they waited to see a doctor, Alex fell unconscious in his mother's arms. Doctors rushed the boy into the treatment bay to begin emergency procedures. As Alex's mother helped them remove his shirt, they all noticed the dark purple splotches on his chest.
They lied him down on the bed, and within 1 minute, they're putting masks on and gloves on and telling me to back away.
The ER staff gave him oxygen and intravenous fluids, trying to stabilize the boy. But Alex's blood pressure was plummeting. The nurse hurried Cheryl out of the room.
And the nurse said, we're not sure what's going on, but, just let them work. If you need to call anybody, call them now. And I thought, well, he's got the flu. What are you doing? I couldn't understand it.
The little boy was now in critical condition. As they transferred him to pediatric intensive care, they knew his state was precarious.
And then the nurse brought me to him because he had woken up a little bit. And he looked me right in the eye and said, "Mommy, I feel better now." I thought, okay, then obviously maybe he was just dehydrated or something. And that's when the nurse said, no, we're going to be knocking him out now and paralyzing him so we can put the catheter and everything in.
Alex's long-term prognosis was uncertain. The doctor gave Alex's parents all the information he could. He feared their son had contracted bacterial meningitis. It would take the lab 24 hours to confirm the diagnosis.
And the pediatric doctor told us that he only had about a 50% chance of survival at that point, and that the next 24 hours were going to be critical. And as he's telling us this, the nurse ran in and told us that his blood pressure was dropping again. So he took off out, and my husband and I were sitting there, and we didn't know what to do or anything. And he came back and he said, okay, he's stable again, but this is the way it's going to be for the next 24 hours. And I didn't know how I was going to get through it. I honestly didn't. It was horrible.
It was heartbreaking for the Hansens to see their little boy hooked to tubes and machines. Massive quantities of intravenous antibiotics were being pumped into his tiny body. He needed a respirator to breathe.
He had tubes all over the place, needles all over the place, and he had the purpley black spots all over his body. And I couldn't believe that this had happened within an hour of me seeing him. Because it was no more than an hour that I had seen him from the emergency room to when he was in the ICU.
The bacteria was coursing through Alex's bloodstream. If his mother hadn't brought him to the emergency room early on, he would have died. The doctor warned the Hansens that if Alex survived, he might suffer neurological damage.
I broke down, so the nurse took me out of the room and said, you can't do that in case he can hear you. You have to be strong in front of him. And for about the next 3 hours, I don't really remember who I talked to or what I did. or anything. I think I was more in shock than anything.
The next day, in the hospital lab, Dr. Turrell verified that Alex had bacterial meningitis. It was the 4th confirmed case in less than a month. The same number they might expect to see in an entire year.
We've got to do some more tests, obviously.
The city of Edmonton was facing a killer bacteria. And the epidemic was about to erupt. In Canada, public health officials were confronting a deadly outbreak. A lethal form of bacterial meningitis had taken the life of one teenager. And health officials still didn't know the source of the bacteria.
A lady from the health department talked to me and told me how contagious this was and asked me the names of all the kids that Alex had been in contact with in the past week. And I thought, oh my goodness, he's been in contact with so many people, I can't even start.
Health officials visited daycare centers all over Edmonton. They distributed a warning to teachers and parents. A bacteria was on the loose. Their children were at risk. Two days after 4-year-old Alex Hansen had collapsed in the emergency room, he was still in critical condition. And now, his mother faced a new fear. Doctors were worried Alex had suffered brain damage from his bout with the bacteria. To find out, electrodes were attached to the child's head to record brain activity. Alex's brain had not been damaged by the infection. Now all he had to do was survive. Over the next few days, scores of patients with flu-like symptoms appeared in Edmonton emergency rooms. As worried parents brought in all sorts of sick children.
Many patients with upper respiratory infections came in concerned that they had contracted the disease and wanting reassurance that in fact they did not.
While many did not have the disease, health authority investigators realized that the confirmed cases of meningitis were rising rapidly.
In the middle of January, we had, over a period of less than a week, 5 cases, including a 20-year-old, a 7-year-old, a couple of 4-year-olds, and an infant.
The bacteria had struck 8 victims in under a month. The danger was escalating, and investigators had no link, no common thread among the patients. Health officials were now facing an outbreak of fatal meningitis, and they needed to find out how it was continuing to infect the population.
Because there were no links and because these cases occurred over a fairly short period of time, it just started to create in our minds the idea that perhaps there might be something unusual as far as the circulation of this particular bacteria in the community.
At the University of Alberta Hospital, Dr. Greg Turrell tried to pry clues from the bacteria itself. Turrell suspected one of 2 possibilities. Either the bacteria was a new strain never before seen in Edmonton, or an existing strain that had mutated, becoming more virulent. Up to 5% of the population can carry the basic meningitis bacteria. But if Edmonton was dealing with a new or mutated meningitis strain, this would explain why so many people were getting sick. The population had not yet developed any immunity. Dr. Turl analyzed the bacteria's DNA. What he found was startling. All 8 patients were infected with exactly the same strain. And it wasn't like anything he had seen before. Just like the flu, he suspected the meningitis bacteria had begun to mutate. Now that the lab had identified the bacteria, health officials had a chance of containing the outbreak. A vaccine was available for this type of meningitis, but they had to get it to enough people before they came down with the disease. Dr. Jerry Preddy proposed a massive vaccination program to provincial health officials.
That point is when we really initiated discussions with the Ministry of Health about if and when we would need to do an immunization campaign. We really started to get concerned.
Vaccination programs are expensive and difficult to implement. Dr. Karen Grimsrud of the Provincial Health Authority faced a difficult decision.
Looking at all that information then, Canadian guidelines that look at if you have 10 cases in a certain age group, this 15 to 19-year-olds per 100,000 population, so over a 3-month period, then you should start considering having a vaccine program.
With just under 10 cases, health officials held off, waiting anxiously. And then, a case that would change everything. On February 4th, 2000, Doug McAngus brought his 16-year-old daughter Dawn to a suburban clinic. She had started feeling sick the day before. Dawn had the chills and a fever. She had been vomiting.
I didn't realize what was happening. I knew she was really sick, but I'm thinking, you know, I don't know, maybe she got food poisoning or something. She was so violently throwing up so much.
After a routine examination, the doctor concluded that Dawn had a normal case of the flu. The family was told the virus would run its course in a couple of days. It was an easy case to misdiagnose. That night, they tended to their daughter.
She was lying on the couch. We just kept changing her cloth and everything all night.
Around 4:30 a.m., Doug and Deidre were awakened by a loud thud.
Doug, did you hear that? Did you hear that?
Dawn had collapsed on her way to the bathroom. In the dim light, Deidre spotted something that took her breath away. Purple splotches on her daughter's skin. The story of Ryan Zelke flashed into her head. She had seen reports about his case on the news.
I noticed she had the 5 purple spots on her chest. At that time, that's when I knew that my daughter had meningitis.
Deidre knew the clock was ticking. Dawn was getting sicker by the hour. There wasn't much time to act before the disease did irreparable damage. In Alberta, Canada, a deadly strain of bacteria threatened the city of Edmonton. Young people were most at risk. One teenager had already died. When Deidre and Doug McAngus spotted the dreaded purple rash on their daughter's chest, they rushed her to the hospital.
You knew that it was serious because they didn't even ask me to do the paperwork, first of all. They just took care of Dawn right off the bat.
The ER doctor immediately suspected bacterial meningitis. He gave her antibiotics right away. There was just a short window to intervene, to kill the bacteria before it was too late. Already, the 16-year-old girl was in agony.
She said, "Mom, my ankles, my ankles." And she was in a lot of pain at that time. The doctors looked at me and they said, "Deidre, you have a very sick child."
The doctors decided to transfer Dawn to the University of Alberta Hospital, where the staff was better equipped to treat her meningitis. In the ambulance, the paramedics gave her oxygen and a sedative to help ease the pain. By the time the teenager arrived in the hospital's intensive care unit, the bacterial infection had shut down both her kidneys and her lungs. She needed a respirator just to breathe.
So they hooked her up to the machine and they were cleaning the blood to see whether we couldn't get Dawn healthy again. They were, you know, it was a matter of 6 days of having hope and not having hope, and it was just being on a roller coaster.
For nearly a week, Dawn's family kept an around-the-clock vigil at her bedside.
We had to put on gloves and masks on our faces, and I couldn't handle seeing my sister like that. She was all hooked up to all these different machines, and she just had purple dots all over her body.
The family was startled to learn that Dawn was just one of several children who had come through the hospital recently with the deadly disease.
Down here, Mom. Okay. I'll go get you some water.
I couldn't believe it. I thought, why isn't anyone else coming forward? Why didn't anyone know what this meningitis and how, you know, severe it is, and it's a terrible disease.
Nearly a week after she was first admitted, doctors told her family Dawn had developed some bleeding in the brain. The news was even worse than they feared.
He said, "There's nothing you can do. Her kidneys shutting down, her liver shut down, her brain, she was totally brain dead. There was no way of her coming back to life."
Now the McAnguses faced a terrible decision.
So they said to me, we'll disconnect all the machines and see if she can function by herself.
They agonized and decided to take their daughter off life support.
I held on to Dawn's arm, and they disconnected her. And she was dead.
Dawn died February 10th, 2000 at 4:05 in the afternoon. Fighting her own despair, Deidre McAngus contacted the local television station. She was determined to warn other parents. A deadly bacteria was killing Edmonton's young people.
I said, you get a hold of every news person, every reporter that we know in town, and I want a story done. I don't want other people to go through what I've just gone through.
Dawn's tragic story made headlines all over the province. Health officials learned that yet another teenager had meningitis. They decided to act immediately.
Whenever we have a meningococcal case and there's a death associated with it, it's guaranteed to be of interest to the media, and therefore the public becomes concerned. So we felt there should be some action.
The health authority decided they had to launch the massive immunization campaign they'd been considering. It was their only chance to stop the outbreak.
This is really just capital, but we do have the one case of the young man that lived.
At a press conference, health officials announced they would start vaccinating 15 to 19-year-olds, the highest risk group for this outbreak of meningitis. But even as the orders went out, many worried that they might already be too late. The lethal threat was spreading, and fast.
Parents of children of all ages.
Parents in Alberta, Canada, were facing their worst nightmare. A deadly disease that preyed on young people and had taken the lives of 2 teenagers. Public health officials decided they had to act fast, to start a mass immunization program, even if they weren't 100% sure it would work. Dr. Jerry Preddy mobilized the agency's resources for the enormous task ahead.
We didn't have much time, and we really had to do a large number of people over a very short period of time. So we did set up several sites across the region in community locations where people could come. And whether they were in school or whether they were working, then this was available to them.
15 to 19-year-olds were targeted first because they were most at risk. By mid-February, just 6 weeks after the outbreak began, the immunization program was underway. Long lines of teenagers streamed into the clinics to begin receiving vaccinations. But to immunize over 50,000 teens, the health department needed a large quantity of the vaccine, a much larger supply than they had.
It wasn't an easy task to get vaccine into the province to vaccinate a large number of individuals, and they went out of their way to fly the vaccine from across North America, and I believe they even were doing some sourcing out in Europe to get enough vaccine here for us.
Regional health officials also set up a hotline to talk with worried parents. Fear had spread through the community even faster than the disease. 15,000 calls came in the first 3 days alone. Within a week, the health authority had vaccinated 25,000 young men and women. Within 8 weeks, more than 50,000, nearly every one of the teens at risk. Now all they could do was wait and hope that their vaccine would work. But other parents were concerned that younger children weren't being protected by the vaccination.
Even though the initial high disease rate was in teenagers, there was the potential to spread to younger children. We did then quickly decide that we would announce a campaign for, all children under the age of 19.
As public pressure mounted, the health authority added 2 to 14-year-olds to the list. Eventually, health officials would inoculate people from ages 20 to 24 as well.
This year, it's really dropped off now. I think we're seeing now the full impact of the immunization program, because it's 76% of people between the ages of 2 and 24 in this province were vaccinated.
In the end, 2 months after the outbreak began, the health authority and the people of Edmonton could breathe a sigh of relief. No new reports of the disease had surfaced. The vaccine had worked. It had stopped an epidemic in its tracks. And each shot would last 3 to 5 years. Today, the lethal bacteria has not vanished. It is still present in Edmonton, still a threat to those who have not been vaccinated. But now at least the people there have some protection. Today, Alex Hansen, one of the youngest victims, is back to normal. Surviving meningitis without serious effect, he's growing up happy and healthy.
He has made a full recovery. He had 1 or 2 little scars, one on his ankle and one on his back from the blood clots, but those have gone away in the last year or so.
Matthew Boulding also recovered completely. He's now studying engineering at a local university. His brush with death has given him and his family a new outlook on life.
I think we all changed a little bit, and I think Matthew, in my opinion, probably changed, because I think when you're 18, you feel really strong and you can do all these things. You can stay out all night, you can work, you can study, you can do everything. You just feel invincible. And I think it probably made him feel less invincible. Like he could, something can happen to him too. Maybe it happened to all of us. Maybe all of us thought that. Maybe it just made us think about how fragile life is.
Dawn's parents, Deidre and Doug McAngus, found strength in tragedy and put it to work. They established the Meningitis Foundation of Alberta. Their own loss allows them to help others as they grieve the death of a child.
Having a child die, I certainly believe that I've gone through the very worst possible thing that I possibly can go through. So I'm not afraid of absolutely anything anymore. I'll take on any challenge or anything in this day and age, because I honestly believe that I've been through the worst thing that could possibly happen.
The Edmonton outbreak of 2000 infected 49 people and claimed 3 lives. Today, many mysteries remain about the deadly disease. No one has been able to figure out exactly how it arose or how it spread. But this much is sure. In Edmonton, the mass immunization program continues to save lives by keeping a killer at bay. In Minneapolis, doctors and public health officials battle a terrifying outbreak. The first victims are children, but then the epidemic expands. Now scientists must identify the contagion and track it to its source. Until the mystery is solved, no one is safe from the invisible threat. Some of the names in this program have been changed. On August 8, 1998, at 4 a.m., Marilyn Miller was awakened by her child's frightened cries.
What's the matter, honey? Come here. Let's see. Oh my gosh, come on. Get you to the bathroom. Come on, sweetie.
8-year-old Billy was seized with terrible abdominal pain.
Tommy, come here. Tom, hurry up. He's really sick.
He was burning with fever.
Hold on. When did this start? When did it start?
I don't know.
Billy needed medical attention, and fast.
Easy now. Okay, you'll be fine.
This wasn't a normal childhood fever. Something was wrong. Billy was losing consciousness. The Millers rushed to a hospital in Minneapolis.
We're gonna be there.
By the time they reached the emergency room, the child was dangerously dehydrated.
I need an ER stat. I need some normal saline with an IV setup.
The pain spread throughout Billy's entire abdomen.
When did this start?
To Dr. Mitchum, the attending physician, appendicitis seemed unlikely. She immediately suspected food poisoning.
And when was the last time he ate?
I guess last night he had chicken and some pasta, vegetables.
Is that what the rest of the family had also?
No, we all had something different.
Dr. Mitchum asked nurses to take blood and stool samples for analysis.
We're going to need to admit him for observation for a few days. When we get the test results back this evening from the blood tests and the stool samples, we should have more of an idea of what's making him sick.
Okay.
We'll take care of you, fella. We need a bed, please. We'll take good care of you and get you better, okay?
In the lab, doctors found blood in Billy's stool. It indicated intestinal bleeding, possibly from a foodborne bacteria. The stool samples were cultured in different sugar solutions and placed in an incubator. If bacteria were present, they would multiply within 24 hours. Until they had lab results, doctors could not treat Billy's symptoms aggressively. With some foodborne bacteria, antibiotics can cause life-threatening complications. Billy had been given anti-fever medication and IV fluids to fight the dehydration. Now all they could do was wait.
Medic 21 dispatch, we're en route to Fairfield Memorial.
The next morning, paramedics were called to a suburb of Minneapolis. 4-year-old Skylar Hartman was extremely sick.
I think she's pretty dehydrated. I'm gonna go ahead and give her an IV.
She had been vomiting for 12 hours and had severe diarrhea.
All right, you're gonna feel a little needle poke. You ready? Okay, I know this is a trying time.
Her fever had spiked to 104 degrees.
Hi, Dad.
Okay, what we got here?
4-year-old female patient. Patient with fallen lying supine on the couch.
By the time Skylar reached the emergency room, her pulse was weak and her blood pressure was dropping.
The last 24 hours, nausea, vomiting. Mom says she got progressively worse over the last couple of hours.
Okay, let's get her into bed.
Got an IV established, a little saline. I gave her a fluid bolus to try and get some fluids.
All right.
One, two, three. Lung sounds are clear. Just have decreased level of consciousness. This is the worst that I've seen her yet.
Doctors were concerned she was going into shock. If her blood pressure was not stabilized, her organs could shut down. Her symptoms were similar to Billy Miller's. Doctors ordered a stool sample and a complete blood workup.
Okay, when was the last time she ate?
Last night.
In the lab, Billy's test results were in. A chemical reaction had occurred, turning one of the solutions pink. This gave doctors their answer. They were dealing with Shigella, a dangerous foodborne bacteria. Shigella is a single-celled organism that attacks its victim's digestive system. The bacteria penetrates the cells of the intestines, causing inflammation and bleeding. The illness it inflicts is called shigellosis. Dr. Tim Namey is a medical epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta.
Shigella itself can cause a very, very nasty infection. They will have severe diarrhea that may be bloody, they will have severe vomiting, often have high fevers, and can become quite dehydrated and quite ill. And for people, especially who are either very young or quite old, they can have can cause them substantial health problems.
How are you feeling today?
Without treatment, Shigella can migrate into the bloodstream, sending the body into shock. This can lead to organ failure. The next day, Billy's condition continued to deteriorate. Nurses monitored him for signs of shock.
This one. How are you feeling?
Marilyn Miller, Billy's mother, was also feeling sick.
Cramping.
Her symptoms were identical to her son's. The wrenching abdominal pain was a sign of shigellosis.
Can we get some vitals on her, nurse, please? I want to give you the phone number here.
The Miller's illness seemed more than coincidence. Dr. Mitchum feared she was seeing the beginning of an outbreak.
And what might have caused the food poisoning.
Okay.
She put the Millers in touch with the Minnesota Department of Health. Epidemiologist Julie Wickland is an expert in foodborne bacterial illness. Julie needed to find out what Billy and his mother had eaten over the past 4 days.
Just 1 second, I have to grab a foodborne illness form. Many times the public calls and thinks that they became sick due to a certain restaurant or a certain food, usually the last thing that they ate. But many times it can be days earlier that is really the cause of what made them sick. So there was a group of you?
Several restaurants were listed in their food histories. Julie wondered if one of them was contaminated.
Okay.
Later that afternoon, Skylar Hartman was still burning with fever. When her stool samples were cultured, it confirmed doctors' suspicions.
Shigella culture to identify.
Thank you.
Skylar was also infected with Shigella. For the second time in a matter of hours, Julie Wickland was alerted. It was her job to determine if the 2 cases of illness were linked. When she took a 4-day food history for Skylar, she made an important discovery. 3 days earlier, both the Hartmans and the Millers had eaten at Angela's, a Minneapolis restaurant.
Sounds good, thanks. Bye-bye. That kind of ratchets things up a bit. It changes the intensity of our investigation. It's not just a passive situation, but now we're trying to do some active looking at what might be the cause of the connection between these people.
If a local restaurant was contaminated with Shigella, they would have to work quickly. Dr. Craig Hedberg was supervisor of the Foodborne Diseases Unit.
It can be a life-threatening condition, so it is a serious infectious disease that we're concerned about. It's also an organism that can be passed from person to person.
Health officials mobilized. Their first stop was Angela's, the restaurant where the sick patients had eaten. They teamed up with the Minnesota Environmental Health Department, which is responsible for restaurant inspections and licensing.
Hi, we're here from the health department.
Investigators suspected the source of the illness was somewhere on the premises, but finding it would be difficult.
All right, we have a lot of things we need to do while we're here. Part of the investigation involves looking basically in every nook and cranny in the restaurant, trying to look at the kitchen, talking about food preparation, looking at sources of the food.
Investigators checked the temperature inside the freezers and refrigerators. The kitchen layout and preparation methods met safety standards. Shigella isn't found in the usual places, like contaminated chicken or meat. It is not carried by animals. Humans are the only significant carrier of this disease. Shigella can also live in water. Officials collected samples for testing. They gathered the restaurant's staff. Outbreaks of Shigella in restaurants are most commonly caused by improper hand washing by a food handler.
When you see foodborne outbreaks related to Shigella, it's caused by food handlers or people who are preparing food who are sick themselves with Shigella. They have a little bit of it on their hands, and it gets into the food, and people get sick.
Investigators conducted interviews with each of the restaurant's employees. Some of them reported being sick themselves, with symptoms consistent with shigellosis.
Whether or not you've been sick, if anything.
Health officials gathered the reservation lists and credit card receipts for the week the patients had eaten there. The restaurant had served nearly 400 people that week. All of the patrons were at risk of contracting shigellosis. When an employee tested positive for Shigella, officials closed the restaurant's doors.
Once we determined that there was illness among employees, we wanted to make sure that this restaurant would be closed so that there would not be further contamination.
Now Julie had to find out how many diners were experiencing symptoms of shigellosis. It was a massive job, and she had to work fast. Shigella is an extremely infectious disease. It can be passed in a handshake, and it only takes a few of the bacteria to make someone ill. Julie brought in a team of students to help with the workload.
Each interview can last for 10 or 15 minutes. So if you are interviewing 100 or 200 people by the time you make the phone calls and get answering machines and actually get back to people, it can take quite a bit of time.
Circle yes or no if that's what they answer. Just don't skip any questions.
Are there people who are going to be around tonight for interviewing?
Yeah, I think we're all lucky.
Okay. Okay, and then I have a list of the names of the people who ate there during that week.
They used a questionnaire to take a detailed record of the victim's symptoms and when they began.
I'll go make some copies. Okay.
Health officials discovered that the illness was widespread. Out of 400 patrons, over half showed symptoms of shigellosis. The health department asked each of them to submit stool samples for testing. Several restaurant employees also tested positive for Shigella. It supported the theory that an infected food handler was the source of the contamination. But when they analyzed the data further, health officials were surprised by what they found. Many of the patrons had become sick before the employees. The employees at Angela's weren't the cause of the outbreak after all.
So then it made us think that it was not likely that the employees were the cause of the outbreak, but also victims of the outbreak.
If it wasn't the employees, then it had to be a contaminated food item the restaurant had served. Angela's staff scoured the kitchen. They discarded all of the food.
It is very chaotic. You are trying to work with the restaurant to prevent further cases. You're trying to make sure that the food handlers that work there are safe to go to work. You're trying to advise the public about what has happened, and you are trying to get to the source of the problem.
Angela's would have to pass a health inspection before they could reopen. Infected employees could return to work, but only after they obtained proof of their recovery from a physician. As health officials searched for the source, 4-year-old Skylar Hartman took a turn for the worse. The infection raged through her tiny body. The youngest victims of the outbreak were the most at risk of developing dangerous complications. Skylar was monitored for signs of hemolytic uremic syndrome, a life-threatening condition that can cause kidney failure. Another danger was that the bacteria could enter her bloodstream. If the infection became bloodborne, it could kill her. In August of 1998, Minnesota residents were attacked by a dangerous foodborne bacteria. Over 200 people became infected with shigellosis after eating in a Minneapolis restaurant. A week later, doctors and health officials faced a second Shigella outbreak in a suburb north of the city. Tara Parker, a 33-year-old teacher, had been sick for days. Now, she was delirious with fever and dangerously dehydrated. The lack of fluids caused her blood pressure to plummet. Paramedics rushed to stabilize
Can
her.
you sit up a little bit, okay? Can you sit up a little bit? There you go. Take a nice deep breath. Tara, what were you doing today? You know where you are right now?
Tara's symptoms were alarming. The abdominal cramps and severe diarrhea pointed to food poisoning. The Minnesota Health Department was notified immediately. The previous weekend, Tara had gone to dinner at an upscale restaurant called Baxter's. 2 days later, she and her friends were violently ill. Baxter's became the second Minnesota restaurant linked to illness in 1 week.
Identify.
Thank you.
Tara's stool samples tested positive for Shigella.
The fact that these outbreaks had an onset, it was quite close in time, but spaced far apart, geographically, was very unusual. That led us to wonder if there was something that was common to both the outbreaks.
Health officials tracked down the victims of the second outbreak.
From the health department, I'd like to ask us a few questions. I could just have a few questions.
They took food histories and asked them to submit stool samples for testing.
About your past medical history and some of the symptoms you're experiencing right now. Okay. And are you experiencing any cramping?
So I've been accompanied those cramps, and it's gotten worse too.
Okay.
Each day, more victims of the outbreak called into the health department. The total number of cases in Minneapolis skyrocketed to over 300. At the Minnesota Department of Health, officials looked for a connection between the two outbreaks. They constructed a case control study, a public health tool that analyzes what the sick patrons had eaten in comparison to the healthy patrons. The results were puzzling.
Get a salad.
There were no food items that only sick patrons had eaten. The two restaurants shared no employees, and there was no common water supply. Yet they still suspected the outbreaks were related. The lab would provide critical information. Bacteriologist Dave Boxroot and his staff zeroed in on the bacterial predator. They needed to compare Shigella samples taken from victims of both outbreaks.
Okay.
First, they extracted pure Shigella from the samples. The tiny rectangular plug contained concentrated Shigella DNA.
All bacteria have DNA just like all humans do, and we can compare the patterns with the computer, and we can tell whether things have identical or different fingerprints.
The pure Shigella from each patient would be compared using a test called pulsed field gel electrophoresis, or PFGE. The PFGE test allows scientists to read and compare the DNA fingerprint of each Shigella sample. First, The gel plate is put in a water bath where an electric current is run through the samples. The current causes the DNA to break into pieces. Then it is placed in a chamber and read with an ultraviolet light. When the ultraviolet light passes through the Shigella DNA, it breaks into a distinct visual pattern. They discovered that the Shigella DNA from both outbreaks matched. This meant they were caused by the same contaminated source.
Looks like we've got a lot of similarity between those 5.
Well, the moment when we found out that there were 2 restaurants in different parts of the state affected by the same extremely rare strain of an already unusual foodborne pathogen at the same time made us know the problem likely did not come from the local area, and indeed probably came in on a food product that was shipped into Minnesota, because even though Minnesota is a big agricultural state, most fresh produce comes from outside. And when you figure that out, you realize that probably a number of states have been affected by the same problem, and that is really a profound realization.
Public health officials in Minnesota had done everything they could to contain the outbreak. The 2 contaminated restaurants had been closed. But true to form, Shigella struck again. 60 miles away, 40 people became ill after attending a county fair. It looked like shigellosis. 16-year-old Kelly Davis was a high school student. She had gotten a part-time job at the fair to help save for college. Now, she was fighting for her life. Her symptoms were too familiar for coincidence. Severe abdominal pain, diarrhea, and dehydration.
Take some deep breaths, honey.
She also had an extremely high fever. Her severe dehydration caused her blood pressure to plummet. Doctors worried she wouldn't make it through the night. There were now 3 suspected outbreaks of shigellosis. The outbreak was spreading. Health officials were powerless to stop it. 25,000 people attend the fair each year. With so many visitors, a contaminant like Shigella could cause a massive epidemic. Investigators contacted each of the 40 victims to learn what they had eaten. They had all eaten different foods from vendors all over the fairgrounds. Each of the vendors had to be inspected for contamination. Every one of them met strict safety standards. Investigators were left with one frightening possibility. The Shigella could be in the fairgrounds' water supply. If so, thousands of people were at risk of developing the dangerous illness. County health officials took water samples from several locations at the fairgrounds. They were sent to the Minnesota Department of Health laboratory. The water samples were incubated overnight. Under ultraviolet light, a cloudy luminescence would indicate the presence of bacteria. Health officials' fears were confirmed. The water at the fairgrounds was contaminated with Shigella, and it was the same strain that had attacked the restaurants. Health officials were stumped. How did the contaminated water supply relate to the restaurant outbreaks 60 miles away? Further investigation revealed that the fairgrounds' underground pipes were bad. And to complicate matters, raw sewage was leaking into the water supply. It was a chilling discovery.
What we believe happened in that case was that there were people who had become ill after eating at one of the restaurants, who had been out at the county fairgrounds, probably while they were ill, had to use the toilet facilities out there, and as a result of that, some of the water systems there became contaminated.
A single source of bacteria had infected 2 restaurants and now the county fairgrounds. Thousands of people had been exposed to a virulent strain of Shigella. Minnesota was under attack, and the source of the outbreak remained a mystery. In 1998, a dangerous foodborne bacteria called Shigella had infected hundreds of people in Minnesota. In Minneapolis, health workers were fighting a losing battle against the emerging epidemic. Elderly victims were hit hardest, their bodies too frail to fight the ravages of the disease. 7-year-old Billy Miller, one of the outbreak's first victims, had been given a full course of antibiotics. But the infection still raged in his system 4 days later. For doctors, it was an ominous sign. It meant this strain of Shigella bacteria had developed a resistance to antibiotics. The parents of the sick children were terrified. If Shigella invades the bloodstream, it can cause shock and even death. 4-year-old Skylar Hartman was now in critical condition. Without effective antibiotics, she would have to fight the disease on her own. Officials at the Minnesota Department of Health issued a nationwide alert. DNA analysis revealed that all 3 Shigella outbreaks in Minnesota had come from the same contaminated source. It was an unusual strain for the area. That meant the bacteria had originated somewhere else. Scientists feared the cases in Minnesota were just the beginning of a much bigger problem.
The standards are in lanes 1, 5, and 10.
Bacteriologist Dave Boxrud emailed an image of the bacteria's DNA fingerprint to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
No, I think you should send it.
In Atlanta, the CDC's foodborne illness surveillance team tried to determine how far the bacteria had spread. They posted data from the Minnesota outbreak on PulseNet, a computerized database that tracks foodborne illness in the United States and Canada. The DNA fingerprint of the Shigella in Minnesota was entered into the database. It was compared to bacterial DNA collected in other outbreaks in North America.
PulseNet is a very, very important communications tool. It allows sharing of patterns of bacteria that allow you to say if the Shigella that shows up in Los Angeles is the same as the Shigella that showed up in Minneapolis.
Scientists discovered that it was. And not just in California. There were outbreaks in Boston, Massachusetts, Marathon Key, Florida, and in Alberta and Ontario, Canada. In each case, restaurants were the source of the outbreak. How many other restaurants nationwide were unknowingly dishing out doses of Shigella?
It's like a ticking time bomb. There's still possibility for human illness and possibly death if the ultimate source of the problem is not addressed.
A nationwide search was launched as the investigation in Minnesota continued. Health officials returned to the contaminated restaurants. There had to be a single food item, something the victims had all eaten.
The roasted chicken.
Investigators and chefs scrutinized the restaurant's menus. They broke each recipe down into a list of ingredients.
We started to dissect the menu and dissect the individual food items to find out what they might have in common. And particularly with Shigella, we'd be looking for things that are raw type food items, things like chopped lettuce, tomatoes, or onions. What we did was ran the data analysis again.
Vegetables.
This time, one food item was highlighted. Most of the sick patrons had eaten dishes that used parsley as an ingredient or as a garnish. To investigators, it was an important clue. Parsley is a food item that often goes unnoticed.
Parsley is what we sometimes refer to as a stealth food. In other words, it comes in a box. It is then subsequently maybe chopped up into small things and then is scattered about on a wide variety of dishes.
The restaurants used parsley liberally, both as an ingredient and as a garnish. They had unknowingly served large doses of the toxic bacteria to their patrons.
The pieces really started to fall into place, that indeed we were dealing with not only a common bacteria that had been imported on a common vehicle, namely parsley, and that this parsley likely, came from outside of Minnesota, because no parsley is grown in Minnesota.
The outbreak was now raging out of control. 486 cases of shigellosis were confirmed in 4 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. Now investigators needed to find out how the parsley became contaminated.
We say, okay, where did this parsley come from? How is it distributed? Contamination can be introduced at any step along the way. And our job is to find out, with as great a likelihood and as great a certainty as we can, where where the contamination was introduced, and then ultimately to fix it.
Public health officials worked with the Food and Drug Administration to trace the parsley back to its source. Starting at the infected restaurants, officials worked backwards.
When you go to do a traceback of parsley, parsley doesn't come with a barcode. So often there's a lot of confusion in the restaurant, which batch of parsley was that and where did that come from?
They reviewed the receipts from each restaurant to learn where the parsley came from. A dozen different distributors had supplied parsley to restaurants in the area. Following up with the distributors would take time. And as each day passed, the tainted parsley would continue to poison more and more people. In August of 1998, an epidemic swept North America. Hundreds of people fell victim to highly toxic Shigella bacteria. Public health officials had traced the source to contaminated parsley. Now, they had to find out where the parsley was grown.
Well, when there's an outbreak of foodborne illness or really any other type of outbreak, but particularly infectious disease outbreaks, the race is really on to get to the bottom of the problem, to solve the problem, to prevent disease that is either being transmitted actively or may be transmitted in the future. And it really becomes quite hectic and quite frenetic.
The CDC launched a traceback. They relied on investigators from the Food and Drug Administration to trace the parsley from the consumer to the source.
The global food supply is much, much more complex than it used to be. Products are moving faster, they're coming from farther distances, they may be reprocessed, repackaged, and reshipped into other places, and it can be a heck of a job to get that all figured out.
Fresh produce is imported to the United States from all over the world. Parsley comes from South America, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as neighboring Mexico and Canada. FDA investigators used invoices to identify the parsley distributors that supplied the contaminated restaurants. From there, they learned which farms had grown the parsley. One of them, a farm in Mexico, had supplied 6 of the 7 contaminated restaurants. A team of investigators rushed to Valle Verde, a large produce farm near Ensenada, 100 miles south of the California border. Officials from both the FDA and the CDC inspected the site. Valle Verde had 55 acres of parsley. They also grew tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuce. Nearly all their produce was shipped to the U.S. Officials believed the answer to their mystery lay somewhere on this land. First, they inspected the farm's irrigation system. Tainted water is one of the most common causes of produce contamination. The farm's water came from wells sunk into an old riverbed.
They used to irrigate, it's the same water that they drink.
They were deep wells, so it was an unlikely source of contamination. The team also investigated a reservoir on the farm's property.
Aquí? Here, Dave. ¿Podemos quitar un ejemplo? Yeah, he says.
It looked clean, but officials collected samples. They would be shipped back to the United States for testing. It was now 6 months into the outbreak, and the source of the Shigella was still a mystery.
These are the irrigation towers right over here.
Officials felt certain it had originated at the farm, but they had no scientific evidence to prove it. As the team traveled from site to site, they made an important observation. Farm workers were drinking expensive bottled water. Clearly, some felt that the local water was unsafe. Investigators wondered if the municipal water supply had ever come in contact with the parsley.
You ready to go? Go. Go.
At the farm's packaging and processing shed, the team learned that the parsley was harvested each morning and shipped out by 2 p.m. that same day. But before it was shipped, it was run through a large machine called a hydrocooler. The parsley was sprayed with chilled water to keep it fresh during transport and increase its shelf life. The hydrocooler pulled its water from the municipal water supply. The last step in the process could have contaminated tons of produce. Officials would soon learn whether or not their hypothesis was correct. In the summer of 1998, an epidemic of foodborne illness was traced to an unlikely source. Parsley served in restaurants across the United States and Canada had been contaminated with the toxic bacteria Shigella. 486 people reported illness. Hundreds more may have suffered in silence. U.S. health officials traced the parsley to a Mexican farm. They suspected local water was to blame. The officials investigated the municipal facility that supplied water to the farm. A manager admitted the facility's chlorinator had been disabled by vandals. It had been out of service for a month. Without chlorine, it was highly possible Shigella was flourishing in the town's drinking water. Negligence at the local level put not only the town at risk, but also the thousands of people who ate the farm's produce. Water samples from the farm were analyzed at the FDA laboratory in Washington, D.C. There, scientists ran tests to determine whether the unchlorinated town water contained the same strain of the Shigella bacteria that attacked victims throughout the U.S. and Canada. Testing revealed that the strains matched. FDA scientists alerted the CDC and the Minnesota Department of Health. Finally, the 6-month-long mystery was solved. For health officials, the Shigella outbreak served as a warning. At different times of the year, as much as 75% of fresh produce sold in the U.S. is shipped in from other countries. The Food and Drug Administration inspects only 2% for contamination. From a public health perspective, that is a frightening statistic.
When you have food that is mass-produced and then spread across the country and indeed across the globe, one problem in one plant or in one location can be rapidly amplified in time and space across the globe.
Ensuring the safety of the food supply has become increasingly difficult in today's complex world economy. Finding and eliminating bacteria before it slips across borders is a global problem.
In an era of evolving food economies and evolving methods of food production, we need to ramp up our abilities in public health to be able to do investigations and studies and tracebacks that match the international and complex nature of these food distribution channels that we're now confronting.
As officials develop new ways to confront these new challenges to public health, the threat remains.
Given the fact that more fresh produce comes from other parts of the world, we may see Shigella become a more common foodborne pathogen.
Those whose lives were touched by the 1998 outbreak know firsthand the debilitating effects of foodborne illness. It took Tara Parker literally months to recover. Younger patients regained their health more quickly. Skylar Hartman, once so close to death, made a full recovery.
Hey, look at you. I got some good news for you. Like you're doing a lot better.
Billy Miller was one of the first children to become ill. After weeks in the hospital, he regained his strength and could finally go home. Countless people affected by the Shigella outbreak did not report their symptoms. Officials suspect that nearly 1,000 people may have been infected. Thanks to the dedication of doctors and public health officials, there was not a single fatality.